Close your eyes for a moment and picture Wisconsin not as the dairy green postcard you drive through, but as a landscape that remembers, where low ridges and river bends keep secrets measured in earthen breaths. You expect quiet farms, county roads, the ordinary map of small towns, but the ground under our feet is older than our maps. It holds intentional shapes, animals traced in soil, flat-topped mounds that once supported wooden temples, hidden cemeteries that were laid with careful hands and deliberate ceremony. Those familiar sights, River Bend, Oak Ridge, Lone Cornfield, can flip, in an instant, into places charged with other timelines, migrations and trade routes, travelers who followed rivers like highways, ceremonies that stitched a world together long before modern borders existed. That contrast, between what we expect and what the land keeps, is where this story begins, and where it refuses to stop asking questions. I'm asking you to come with me, listen carefully to the rhythms of the past, let the names of places roll like stones in a quiet stream, and hold, for a moment, the wonderful discomfort of not knowing. We promise revelations, some small and concrete, some tantalizing and unresolved, and this is a promise to you. We will follow the evidence where it leads, name our gaps honestly, and refuse tidy endings when the facts don't allow them. This isn't sensationalism dressed as history, it's curiosity with a reporter's rigor and a storyteller's eye. It's also personal. When you stand before a mound or walk the loop around an ancient village site, you stand in a conversation that concerns everyone who has ever wondered how we got here, who we were, and whom we left behind. Consider, for a moment, how many of these earthworks across Wisconsin formed not as accidental humps, but deliberate shapes. Birds, panthers, turtles, scales and silhouettes visible only from a slight rise or from the vantage of a modern drone. The tradition of building mounds in recognizable forms swept across this region between roughly 800 BC and AD 1200, a long arc of human activity that folded in many peoples and many meanings. These were not anonymous heaps of dirt. They were statements, burial, memory, cosmology, constructed with the intention of being seen and felt, sometimes in processional arrays, sometimes in clumps of funerary practice. Places like the dozens of effigy mounds you can still walk near lakes and ridgelines were, in other words, landscapes that spoke. Archaeologists and Indigenous oral histories both tell us that these mounds were not merely pragmatic, they were spiritual topography. We can measure their ages, map their alignments, and analyze the bones and artifacts found within them, but those scientific measurements only feed the deeper question: what did those shapes mean to the people who put them there? The short answer is complex, and the explorations we undertake in this script will chase that complexity, sometimes arriving at solid conclusions, sometimes at mysteries that stubbornly resist closure. Another place to start: imagine a village bounded by a wooden stockade, with a plaza at its heart, raised platform mounds where buildings sat like stages above the commons, flanked by rivers used as arteries for trade and travel. Aztalan, one of Wisconsin's most studied sites, fits that image. Between roughly AD 1000 and 1300, people in this part of southern Wisconsin lived in a settlement that looked, in miniature, like some of the great Mississippian towns farther south, complete with plazas and platform mounds. For years, archaeologists have argued about the degree to which Aztalan represents a local tradition adapting Mississippian influences versus a colony or outpost consciously connected to larger centers such as Cahokia across the Mississippi. The artifacts, work stone, pottery with distinctive tempering, occasional copper items, tell a story of contact, trade, and cultural blending. But they also raise the prickly questions: who moved where, and why? How far did political or religious ideas travel down river valleys? And when we walk that stockade line in our imagination, can we truly reconstruct the social rhythms of a place that was abandoned centuries before our modern townships were drawn? The concrete things we can point to, post holes, charred hearths, remnants of raised earth, anchor our narrative. The rest, why people left, how external forces shaped their choices, remains subject to competing theories and sometimes stubborn silence. Then there are stories that move between evidence and legend, the ones that make you tilt your head and ask whether myth emerged as lapsed memory, deliberate story, or a corrupted report of something else. Wisconsin is, in the popular imagination, a place that occasionally breeds tales of giants and outlandish skeletons, sensational newspaper columns from a century ago, private collectors' tall tales, and local lore that insists remarkable burials once turned up long bones too large for ordinary humans. Modern archaeology has shown most of those stories to be hodgepodges of hoax, exaggeration, and misinterpretation. Some famous cases were deliberately fabricated, others were honest misreadings of animal bones or the fibrous remains of waterlogged wood. Yet it would be foolish to dismiss the persistence of such tales as mere gullibility. They tell us as much about memory, identity, and the appetite for the extraordinary as they do about bones. The right approach is skeptical but open. We should demand evidence, but we should also ask why certain ideas, giants, lost races, petrified skeletons, have legacies that outlive their factual support. The truth, as we'll see, often sits between a scientific report and a campfire story, and both are important to the texture of place. So what follows are case studies, 6 to 8 scenes, each of which is a focused excavation of a different mystery in Wisconsin's ancient past. Each segment will drop a one-sentence teaser to hold the idea, then move through historical context, data, and competing theories, and it will leave you with the same breathless conclusion: we still don't know everything. Along the way, I will invite you, again and again, to imagine yourself at these places. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, paddle skiff on a slow river at noon, standing where a platform mound once rose and feeling the wind as a kind of memory. Our mode is documentary and cinematic, authoritative, but conversational, evidence-forward, but not afraid of the mythic weight that certain places carry. We will honor Indigenous voices when they are available. We will mark where scientific consensus holds and where theories compete, and we will carefully separate archival fact from the delicious insistence of legend. Above all, we will cling to one guiding principle: the land remembers more than the textbooks sometimes admit, and when we listen closely, carefully, ethically, with attention to context, we find that each mystery opens not to a single answer but to a doorway of human possibilities. Picture, then, the first of our deep scenes, a place of sun-browned earth and tall oaks, where the past has arranged itself in human and animal outlines. Aztalan, an ancient river town with raised platforms and a community that looks like a borrowed echo of a far grander city, the microcosm of a northern Mississippian experiment. Imagine a narrow town settled on a low floodplain beside the Crawfish River, bounded for a time by a wooden stockade, with 3 flat-topped earthen mounds standing like small plateaus and a central plaza that managed both trade and ritual. The dates are relatively precise. The village flourished roughly between AD 1000 and 1300, with the most intense activity clustered during the centuries around AD 1100. Archaeologists have catalogued the presence of Mississippian-style pottery, evidence of maize agriculture, and features that echo larger regional centers, indications of a community in conversation with the greater cultural world of the Mississippi Valley. The scale matters. This is not a scatter of bands moving through the land. It is a settled, reorganized space where social life had a civic dimension, public architecture, ritual space, and marked domestic areas all suggest a degree of social complexity often underappreciated in northern contexts. But here's where it gets tricky. Aztalan feels both local and imported. Ceramic styles suggest local woodland traditions persisted even as Middle Mississippian ideas, platform mounds, plaza orientation, arrive and take root. One leading theory suggests that Aztalan was a small-scale colonizing effort by people connected to Cahokia, traders, priests, or political actors who planted a satellite settlement to control trade routes or sacred landscapes. Another theory argues for cultural diffusion. Local communities adopted Mississippian ritual forms through long-distance exchange without wholesale population replacement. There are also hybrid models that see Aztalan as a place of very specific contact, perhaps a group of immigrants integrated with local clans to produce a distinct identity that borrowed elements without losing its older roots. Material data are the firm ground under these hypotheses. The post-mold patterns show planned architecture. Charcoal and soil layers indicate periods of construction and burning. Copper scraps and exotic lithics indicate trade connections that reach far beyond what you can see from the ridge. Yet those artifacts do not finally tell us who held political sway or how the people themselves narrated their identity. They are pieces that frame possibilities, not a completed picture of a social order. Imagine you walk the stockade line at dawn. There's frost on the grass, the river moves in a slow silver thread, and the first light catches the dampness of disturbed soil where post holes once held upright timbers. Picture children running past the plazas centuries ago. Picture ceremonial life on the mounds, words we cannot recover, dances we can only guess at from post patterns and artifact distributions. Now imagine the day the site was abandoned, if there was a single day, and the slow widening of fields where houses and wooden structures once stood. Archaeological stratigraphy shows episodic occupation, maintenance, and eventual desertion. But why leave? Climatic shifts, resource depletion, political collapse, or social rotation of ritual centers all become plausible suggestions. And yet, for all the evidence, the exact combination of pressures that led to Aztalan's decline remains contested. Some researchers point to environmental stress, flooding, or subtle changes in regional productivity, while others see political changes across the Mississippian world that rewired trade and social alignments, making the northern outpost less viable. Still, for all the evidence stacked in lab reports and field notes, we cannot say, with absolute certainty, the human drama that closed that particular chapter. We still don't know whether people left by choice, were forced out, or simply reorganized their communal life elsewhere, whether the last person to tamp the last roof thresh looked back with sorrow or relief. This site also invites a mythic layer. Local folklore and later romantic accounts occasionally recast Aztalan as the seat of great chiefs or as an abandoned city cursed for unknown reasons, stories that tap a human penchant for dramatic closure. Those narratives, while rarely supported by the hard record, teach us an important lesson: that emptiness invites projection. When we find a place where people once gathered and then left, it is easy, and emotionally satisfying, to imagine catastrophe or moral failing. But archaeological reality is messy. Long-term patterns of mobility, ritual rotation, and environmental fluctuation can produce the same results without a single cataclysmic cause. The mythic impulses, lost princes, hidden treasure, or giants sleeping under the mounds, are cultural ballast, not evidence. They illuminate the storytelling needs of later communities, how to make sense of disappearance. Still, those stories deserve respectful attention because they shaped how 19th-century settlers and even early archaeologists approached sites, sometimes leading to destructive digging or misinterpretation. So stand there with me, in the chill light, measure the palms of your hands against the possible width of a platform mound, imagine the wooden steps up to a structure that no longer exists, picture the river carrying trade goods, shells from the Gulf, copper from the Great Lakes trade, silt-laden water that smelled of fish and reed. The Aztalan story is, in many ways, emblematic of the larger Wisconsin enigma. Strong archaeological signals that mark clear human intention, paired with silence about social meaning. We can plot dates, list artifacts, and trace likely connections. We can also, honestly, say where the theories splinter and why the human drama resists neat closure. We still don't know, exactly, how fully connected these northern enclaves were to their southern counterparts, or what daily life was felt like between the posts and plazas. And that very not knowing is not a failure, it is an invitation. Picture yourself walking the Crawfish River's slow bank at dawn, and listen to the silence not as absence, but as a question waiting for better answers. The sculpted ridges of effigy mounds, animals traced across ridgelines as if someone had taken a giant's finger and drawn icons into the earth, are both statement and question. They mark territory, memory, and intent, and yet their language remains partly closed to us. Across southern Wisconsin, along lake shores and bluff tops, riders of wind and sun once shaped earth into bears, birds, panthers, and serpents. Some stretched 200 feet or more, others compact and intimate, a curled turtle or a crouched fox measured by a single careful arc of soil. Most of these mounds belong to what archaeologists call the late woodland tradition, roughly AD 700 to 1100, a time when people lived in seasonal cycles of hunting, gathering, and increasingly intensive maize cultivation. But those dates only anchor the practice in time. they do not translate its grammar. The mounds cluster in particular landscapes: narrow ridges that catch a river's view, peninsulas that face the water, high terraces that hold the sky. Their scale varies. Some are low berms you might miss unless you slow down, others are built with enough deliberation that they must have taken weeks of communal labor and careful planning. When you walk them, you are literally stepping into a language of place where the builders wrote their cosmology not on a tablet but into the skin of the land itself. But here's where it gets tricky. The effigy tradition appears to be both local and highly expressive of regional networks of meaning. Some scholars posit that the animal shapes were clan totems or spiritual embodiments, markers that declared social identity or relationship to the landscape, while others emphasize processional or calendrical functions, alignments that correspond to solar or lunar cycles, sight lines that frame sunrise over a particular mound on a given date. Excavations have found few direct textual clues, no Rosetta Stone of North American archaeology, so most arguments rely on patterns of placement, burial practice beneath or beside the mounds, and the distribution of artifacts that might suggest ritual exchange. Some mounds contain human remains with grave goods, a shell pendant here, a projectile point there, perhaps a fragment of a carved bone or a bead of freshwater mussel shell. Those artifacts hint at long-distance connections, trade routes that reach to the Gulf and to the Great Lakes, and they hint at ritual economies that valued the symbolic as much as the practical. But the presence of burials is not universal. In some effigies we find no interment at all, which complicates any single interpretation. Were some mounds purely territorial markers? Were others purely ceremonial? Or did the same pile of earth serve multiple overlapping purposes across decades and centuries? Now let your imagination walk the ridge with me. Picture yourself on a low promontory at dawn. Fog clings to the marsh below, the outlines of a great bird mound yawning like a sleeping thing between the trees. Small children, perhaps barefoot, chase one another along the tail of a turtle effigy somewhere down the slope. Elders gather in a circle where a crescent-shaped mound forms a natural amphitheater. The rhythm of labor, the shifting of baskets, the tamping of soil, was accompanied by sound and story, drums echoing through the night, chants calling names we cannot know, offerings set into hollows to honor ancestors or petition the weather. Those lived possibilities are as much part of the mound's meaning as any potsherd or radiocarbon date. Still, for all the evocative scenarios we can conjure, the one-sentence claim that the effigy mounds are clan markers, or they are astronomical calendars, flattens complexity. Many mounds were built in phases. Later generations sometimes reshaped or added to earlier forms. Some effigies align with prominent landscape features, others face away from them. The variety suggests a living practice, adaptable and locally inflected, not a single doctrine imposed across an entire region. Multiple competing theories circle each site like birds, sometimes converging, sometimes diving apart. One school reads the effigies primarily as social text, visual declarations of lineage, totem, or territorial claim, readable to the initiated. Another reads them as cosmograms, three-dimensional maps of the people's mythology, where animals embody directions, elements, or mythic ancestors whose stories govern ritual life. A third emphasizes performance and movement. The effigies are stages for procession, their tails and bodies creating choreographies for communal enactments. Each hypothesis leans on different types of evidence, artifact distributions, contextual burial practice, local oral traditions where available, and each explains part of the picture. What none of them fully answers is the emotive logic that led a community to shape a hill into a crouched bear rather than a simple burial mound, or why certain animal forms cluster in particular valleys. We still don't know how many of the mounds were meant primarily for the dead, how many were living monuments visited annually for ceremonies, or how the symbolic names attached to animals varied from one hamlet to the next. The blank spaces are as instructive as the filled ones. They tell us where to look harder, and where to listen differently. There is, too, a mythic layer that the effigies insist upon, the human impulse to tell larger-than-life stories. Some 19th-century settlers, seeing shapes in the grass, retold them as evidence of lost races or mound builder civilizations unrelated to the indigenous peoples later encountered. Those stories, long discredited by professional archaeology and by indigenous knowledge that confirms continuity rather than rupture, nevertheless persist in popular imagination. Tales of giants sleeping beneath turtlebacks, of buried treasures guarded by enchanted animals. The persistence of those tales says something about the modern hunger for mystery and spectacle. It also warns us about how easily narrative can detour into erasure when it refuses to honor living descendant communities. So we balance a skeptical demand for data paired with reverent attention to the human stories that the mounds continue to inspire. Picture yourself sitting on the flank of a great effigy at twilight, hearing only your own breath and the distant call of a bird. Recognize that the mound is a conversation across centuries, and that our questions about its precise grammar do not diminish its poetic power. We still don't know the full syntax of that conversation, and perhaps that is a kind of mercy, an invitation to keep listening. Far to the north, where the lake winds and the cold rides longer into the year, a different mystery glints in metal and in the stubborn bones of an earlier technological age. The old copper phenomenon, an ancient story of people who mined and hammered native copper into tools and ornaments thousands of years before metallurgy took hold elsewhere on the continent. Here we step away from the late woodland into a much older epoch, the Archaic period, stretching back as far as 4000 to 1000 BC, when bands of people in the Great Lakes region realized that the greenish, heavy rock at the water's edge could be shaped by hammering and annealing, that a metal with a unique heft and a warm color could be turned into spear points, long cutting knives, bracelets, and ritual implements. The source landscapes were not subtle. Rich copper seams on the Keweenaw Peninsula and around Lake Superior supplied raw material that would be worked not only locally but traded far and wide. Artifacts of old copper, oversized spear points, thin-shelled long knives, and ornamental discs, turn up in burial contexts and ceremonial caches, sometimes hundreds of miles from their geological source, prompting questions about the scale and sophistication of trade networks long before the rise of agriculture. But here's where it gets tricky. The technology we call old copper is not metallurgy in the familiar sense. It is the purposeful shaping of native copper, folding, hammering, and sometimes heating it just enough to relieve stress, rather than smelting or at high temperatures. The techniques require knowledge, persistence, and an aesthetic sense for what copper could become. Some old copper artifacts are enormous, clearly impractical for everyday hunting. Their dimensions suggest status or ritual use rather than utility. Others show exquisite workmanship, hammered thin to a fine edge, sometimes shaped into forms that echo the needs of life. Projectile points that could have been used in hunting, but which ended up in burial contexts, implying symbolic value. The big question is not simply technological curiosity but social implication. Who controlled access to metallic raw material? Were copper artifacts valuable in ways that made them central to power and ceremony? Did the production of copper objects create specialists, craftspeople with knowledge transmitted across generations? The evidence points to both specialization and exchange networks. It suggests a world where the sight of a gleaming copper ornament could signal connections that extend from inland lockshores to distant river valleys. Imagine yourself in that older world. You crouch beside a cold stream where the bedrock sometimes exposes veins of copper, fingers numb from water, the seasoning of a long harvest of pebbles and flakes. A pit has been dug nearby, shallow and careful, where flakes of hammered copper lie with charcoal and worn bone. A figure nearby hammers at a small nugget with bone and stone tools, strike, fold, strike again, until the nugget yields to a new form that will travel far from home. You can hear the rhythm of work, time marked in repetition rather than in hours, and sense the value attached to the finished piece. Those objects will cross landscapes as gifts, trade goods, or tokens of alliance, and in some burials they are placed with the dead as markers of identity and status. Still, for all the remarkable preservation of these copper artifacts, we struggle to trace the exact mechanisms of distribution. Was there a proto-marketplace where metal was traded for shells and flint? Were marriages or political alliances brokered through such exchanges? Or was copper exchange tangled with ceremonial gifting networks that defy simple economic models? Multiple competing theories again vie for interpretive space. Some scholars see the old copper phenomena as evidence of early craft specialization and social stratification. people who controlled copper sources and production could accrue prestige and power, thereby altering local social orders. Others argue for more egalitarian interpretations, that copper was widely shared through ritual exchange and that any apparent concentration of wealth in graves may reflect ideological choices rather than durable class divisions. A third perspective emphasizes continuity and cultural logic. Copper objects may have served as cosmological tools, mediators with the spirit world, rather than mere economic goods. Each reading draws support from different patterns of burial wealth distribution, artifact typology, and the contexts in which copper appears. We still don't know the exact social mechanics behind the distribution of copper objects, or the degree to which they restructured social life in a region where agriculture had not yet fully taken hold. And then there are stories that edge toward the fantastical, which is unsurprising when you consider how arresting a copper hand axe or a gleaming disc must have looked to later observers. Early European settlers sometimes misread these ancient items as the work of a distinct, vanished civilization, separate from the indigenous groups they encountered, an era that mingled prejudice with ignorance. Later hoaxes and misattributions, giant copper swords, impossibly large tools, fed tabloids and treasure hunters. Yet even in debunking sensational claims, we find genuine wonders, the technical mastery evident in thin-hammered copper, the trade networks that placed such pieces far from their geological source, the ritual contexts that imbued them with meaning beyond the utilitarian. Picture yourself holding a thin copper blade recovered from a peat bog, its patina catching the light, imagining the hands that once fashioned it and the hands that once reverently placed it at a burial. The artifact is both intimate and remote, quotidian and sacred. We still don't know the full social map that copper traced across the region, the patterns of craft, the paths of trade, and the ceremonies that invested cold metal with living meaning. Each of these segments, effigy mounds and old copper, returns us to the same fundamental posture. We can measure, date, and map. We can propose robust theories grounded in patterns of evidence, yet the human heart of the matter often remains just beyond the reach of our instruments. That limit is not a failure of knowledge so much as a reminder. Every artifact and every earthwork once belonged to a living practice, a world of sound, smell, and speech that does not survive purely in objects. Picture what's next: more sights, more puzzles, more invitations to imagine. We still don't know. Picture, now, a sweep of rounded hills and kettle ponds left behind by retreating ice, a place where people of the archaic period found raw materials not only in the earth but in the shape of the terrain itself. Welcome to the Glacial Kame sites, knolls of gravel and sediment that ancient hands turned into burial places and ceremonial caches. The terse teaser is this: the Glacial Kame burials hint at complex social networks and ritual technologies that predate clear agricultural hierarchies. Move beyond the tantalizing brevity and into a world measured in river miles and pebble counts. These sites span roughly from 3000 to 1000 BC, clustered where glacial deposits left rounded hills and where water pooled in predictable ways. Excavations have revealed carefully placed graves, often with bone pins, polished stone tools, and sometimes exotic beads or pendants that betray travel or trade across surprisingly large distances. The cames themselves are strange gifts of geology and culture, natural mounds chosen, reshaped, or honored as places to lay the dead, as if the people who used them sensed the hill's original voice and responded with ritual. In scale, the burials can be intimate, single interments with personal goods, or aggregations that suggest repeated use over generations. These patterns shift across the landscape, indicating not a single funerary program but a patchwork of local customs woven into a broader pattern of regional contact. But here's where it gets tricky. The Glacial Kame phenomenon resists tidy social labels. One reading sees these places as evidence of emergent social differentiation. The inclusion of rare artifacts in some burials suggests that certain individuals acquired status. Another counters that such artifacts functioned within a lively gift economy, circulating through reciprocal exchange and ceremonial gifting rather than being hoarded by elites. Still another argues that the choice of cames reflected cosmological thinking. The dead were placed on geological heights that mediated between realms, perhaps to help the community maintain a relationship with the spirits bound to particular stones or springs. The artifacts themselves are ambiguous. A polished gorget or a pendant could be a prestige marker, a trade token, or a ritual tool. Radiocarbon dates place many of these burials in a long continuum, but the social meanings woven into those dates remain debated. When you add the layer of organic preservation, petrous bone, charcoal, occasional textile impressions, which survive like whispers in peat or protected loam, you feel close to lives that are still, in key aspects, opaque to us. Picture yourself wandering to a low knoll in late autumn, the grass brittle, the wind carrying the scent of decayed leaves. You trace the contour of a glacial drumlin and imagine small fires that once burned in its lee, the hush of mourners, the careful placing of a pendant at a shoulder. Hear the soft scrape of a flint napping nearby as someone shapes a tool not for everyday use but to accompany a person into the remembered world. That intimacy, the personal alongside the communal, shows why the Kame sites matter. They force us to grapple with how early peoples organized memory, treated the body, and stitched social life to particular features of the land. Yet, for all the careful excavation reports and the stratigraphic graphs, we still confront big blank spaces. How formalized were those funerary practices across communities? Were certain families tied to particular Kames generation after generation, or did access rotate with changing alliances? We still don't know the social code that governed choice of burial place, or the full geographic reach of the networks that left exotic beads in inland graves. Shift the scene toward lockshores and river mouths where water has kept secrets beneath sediment. Imagine a shallow cove where wooden posts once marked the edge of a dock or a domestic palisade, now drowned beneath modern waterlines. The teaser is simple and eerie. Submerged villages and shoreline caches hint that parts of Wisconsin's past lie hidden under lakes where rising waters have rewritten the map. Across the state, paleo-environmental shifts, post-glacial rebound, variances in lake levels, human alteration of watersheds, have drowned or preserved sites in waterlogged contexts. These underwater or water-saturated deposits occasionally yield organic materials that dry land preservation destroys, wooden structures, woven mats, and food residues that can tell us about diet, seasonality, and building techniques. When archaeologists work at such sites, using coring, underwater excavation, or careful shoreline survey, they sometimes find long-lived features, house floors with hearths, post molds defining palisades, caches of organic offerings sealed beneath silt. The potential for insight is enormous because waterlogged contexts hold impressions of living detail we rarely recover on the uplands. But here's where it gets tricky. Submerged contexts are also deceptive. Rising water can displace artifacts, concentrate materials from multiple periods into a single layer, or strip away evidence that would otherwise anchor interpretation. Some curious finds, isolated wooden posts far from any discernible structure, prompt hypotheses that range from ritual deposit to the remains of palisade lines eroded by current. One tempting explanation for certain inland drowned sites is human-induced flooding, beaver damming, milling ponds later modified by settlers, or engineered fish weirs that over centuries transformed shorelines. Another points to climatic shifts that raised lake levels slowly enough that communities adapted by moving, or quickly enough that they abandoned places. The data are noisy: pollen cores, dendrochronology from preserved timbers, and artifact typologies each pull the story in different directions. When a canoe fragment, or a woven mat turns up in a peat pit with a clear date, it can upend assumptions about seasonal use or permanent habitation. Yet many waterlogged finds remain tantalizingly isolated, their broader social context missing. Picture yourself in a small boat at dawn, the fog spilling across the surface of a lake, and reel in a corroded shard of pottery, or an oak post encrusted with silt. There is a particular thrill in a find like this. An object that once sat within easy reach of hands now comes up with the mud clinging to it like time. But the thrill is also tempered by caution. We must interpret what we retrieve in light of water's capacity for movement and mixing. Theories compete. Were these sites permanent settlements that fell to rising waters, seasonal camps that used lakes as highways and storage, or ritual locales where offerings were deliberately placed for the benefit of water spirits? Each possibility has implications for how we reconstruct daily life and community organization. We still don't know the full map of watery preservation in Wisconsin, or the total number of lives that left their traces under lake bottoms, waiting for a future to pull them back to light. Now turn inland to the driftless area, the topographically eccentric heart of southwestern Wisconsin that escaped the smoothing hand of the last continental glaciation. The teaser here reads like a detective's whisper. Strange stone alignments and solitary carved stones in the driftless hills suggest rituals, markers, or lost pathways whose precise meanings evade our categories. In mesas of limestone and along cool spring runs, people over millennia moved stones into patterns, cairns, low walls, petroglyph-like scratches on exposed ledges, sometimes aligning them to landscape features or astronomical events. The permanence of stone gives these features a particular power. They survive centuries of weather and human passage, speaking in a slow, enduring voice. Archaeologists and geomorphologists study their placements, look for associated charcoal or microdebitage, and compare them with ethnographic accounts to form hypotheses. The arrangements are rarely grand architectural complexes. They are often modest, intimate, and easily overlooked, which is precisely why they invite mystery. But here's where it gets tricky. Stones can be moved by many hands, farmers clearing fields, settlers landscaping yards, animals rolling rocks in seasonal floods. Distinguishing intentional human arrangement from chance placement requires careful context. Soil staining, post holes, or artifact scatters that betray human activity. Sometimes the alignments are clearly deliberate. In other cases, what appears architectural dissolves into the landscape upon closer inspection. One interpretive stream reads these stone features as boundary markers, deliberate lines that demarcated resource zones or sacred ground. Another suggests they were mnemonic devices, stone arrays that help people remember oral histories or seasonal routes. A third theory posits a more performative function, low stone walls that channeled movement during ritual procession or hunting drives. The evidence often supports multiple readings. Even when petroglyph-like marks appear on a ledge, dating them is difficult unless associated organic material can be retrieved. Those uncertainties create space for local legends to grow, lost trails, buried caches marked by stone, or traces of pre-contact pathways that cross the landscape like veins. Picture yourself on a spring morning, navigating a narrow trail through oak savanna and finding a line of low stones disappearing into brush. You kneel, brush soil from the face of a ledge, and discover faint incisions that catch the light, a circle, a cross, a spiral. Imagining the hand that made that mark, you feel a kinship with every other human who has used stone to say, "We were here, remember this." Yet the force of the unknown is also a caution. Without careful excavation and respectful consultation with descendant communities, we risk misreading or harming sensitive places. We still don't know whether many of these alignments are the remains of long-lived ritual practices, simple practical markers, or subsequent accretions of meaning layered over generations. Finally, let us drop our narrative to the deep time edge, to the twilight of the Ice Age when the last mammoths and mastodons paused at the edges of thawing plains. The one-sentence tease is as old as the bones themselves. Contested mastodon and proboscidean sites in the region bear marks that some interpret as human modification, opening a debate about early human presence, hunting strategies, and the interactions between people and Pleistocene megafauna. A few deposits in the upper Midwest contain large proboscidean bones, sometimes clustered in ways that invite hypothesis. Were they natural deaths in mire and mud, or the result of human agency? In the decades since such remains have been found, the scientific community has developed strict criteria for identifying butchery marks, tools, and cut patterns that differ from carnivore damage or post-depositional abrasion. Some early reports leapt to the conclusion of human hunting. Later reanalysis urged caution or offered alternative taphonomic explanations. The stakes are high. Demonstrating early and systematic human hunting of mastodons in the region would shift models of migration, subsistence, and social organization in late Pleistocene North America. But here's where it gets tricky. Bones in a bog look like they might have been cut by stone tools. Similar striations can result from trampling, root growth, or the action of ice and freeze-thaw cycles. Isolated stone flakes found nearby may be contemporary tools or later intrusions. Radiocarbon dates, when available, can place the bones in a time bracket, but associating a stone flake directly with a particular bone requires meticulous stratigraphic control. Some researchers champion sites where clear-cut marks align with fractures consistent with marrow extraction, arguing for human agency. Others counter that natural processes produce similar signals, making definitive claims premature. The debate illustrates the discipline at its best: skeptical, methodical, and willing to revise evidence under fresh scrutiny. Picture yourself at dawn on a peat plain, watching the team raise the bones of a massive shoulder blade from the mud. The air smells of peat and cold water. The bone is heavy and dark with age. You peer closely and, under magnification, catch rows of linear marks. Are they tool edges or the scars of another process entirely? Imagining a human presence here at the end of the Ice Age is humbling. People who confronted beasts much larger than themselves, who organized hunts and carried meat across distances that would test endurance. It's also a reminder of how careful we must be when reconstructing the deep past. The difference between a clear-cut mark and an ambiguous groove can alter our stories about where people were and how they lived. We still don't know, with universal agreement, how broadly humans hunted mastodons here, how often they did so, or how those interactions shaped the cultural trajectories that followed. We still don't know, but each of these uncertainties is not emptiness. They are openings. They are the very reasons that archaeologists walk slowly across fields, that local communities tell their stories near the mounds, that conservationists fight to protect shoreline peat and glacial kames from the plow. These places matter because they are porous to meaning. They hold fact and hope, evidence and story, and our job, to yours and mine, is to honor both. Picture the map in your mind now, a patchwork of hills and lakes, mounds and kames, submerged posts and petroglyph-dappled ledges. Hear the chorus of possibilities and the patient voice of scientific method asking for careful proof. Imagine yourself standing in each place, on a kame, in a boat, beside a stone line, at the raised bones of a beast, and sense how close the past can feel when we are allowed to approach with humility, skepticism, and wonder. We still don't know. Picture a map stitched together by rivers and ridgelines, not modern highways, where goods traveled as gifts and bargains and where a single shell or a sliver of copper could tell a story of movement across hundreds of river miles. The teaser is simple and electric: exotic materials and Wisconsin burials, marine shells, Great Lakes copper, non-local stone, reveal wide trade networks and social meanings that still puzzle us. Think in concrete terms. By AD 700 to 1200, beads made from marine shell, worn smooth by long hands, turn up in graves far from any ocean, their perforations drilled with evident care. We find freshwater pearls, conch and whelk shell pendants, and the tiny carved gorgets that once gleamed at the throat of the dead. These objects tied inland communities to people who lived along the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic seaboard, or to brokers who carried goods along riverine paths. Alongside these shells sit pottery types, grooved paddle-marked wares, stamped ceramics, that archaeologists can trace to stylistic horizons and, sometimes, to particular workshops or traditions. The presence of non-local stone, obsidian flakes that fluoresce a dark, volcanic sheen in a Midwestern lab, or the sudden appearance of chert types traceable to distant quarries, complicates a picture of small, isolated bands and folds it into an image of connected polities where objects circulated in webs of exchange that were at once pragmatic and deeply symbolic. This distribution matters because it suggests sustained contact, repeated movement, and a shared vocabulary of value that we still struggle to define fully. But here's where it gets tricky. The simplest reading, material came from point A to point B via trade routes, is true but incomplete. Trade can mean many things. It can mean market exchange. It can mean marriage alliances sealed with gifts. It can mean ritual exchange in which objects are passed around in ceremonial feasts to affirm bonds. Or it can mean the movement of specialists who carried items as part of their itinerant craft. Each hypothesis invokes different social architectures. If shells moved primarily as market commodities, we might expect relatively standardized distribution patterns and evidence of specialized trade centers. If they moved as gifts in ritual contexts, their distribution might cluster around ceremonial mounds and plazas rather than along logistic trails. If they moved with itinerant craftspersons or traders, the pattern would be patchier, tied to roads of mobility that are hard to detect archaeologically. The archaeological record is mercifully generous. Beads, pendants, and associated grave goods tell us that exchange happened, but stingy where it matters most, in the mechanisms. We can identify the material and sometimes its geological source with geochemical analysis. We can map its occurrences across counties and major waterways. But we cannot always see the human hands and agreements that moved those goods from place to place. Now, imagine the human scene. Picture a low bluff over a river where a canoe arrives in late summer, its hull creaking against a muddy bank. A trader steps ashore with a shoulder full of shells, his clothes dusted with salt. He comes to a communal house where people gather for a feast. The shells change hands not in a quick market exchange but in a choreography of ritual offering. A pendant is presented to a clan elder, a string of beads to a bride-to-be, a polished disc placed in a mortuary bundle. The giving is as important as the receiving. In that image, the shells do not simply satisfy desire. They mediate relationships, convey stories of distant people, and help create obligations that bind communities across landscapes. But that is only one plausible image. Another image is less romantic and more organizational. Specialist traders, seasonal people who moved along river corridors, dropped goods at interim caches, exchanged items for locally made tools, and maintained networks of barter that maintained practical supply. Which image is closer to the truth likely varies by time, place, and cultural horizon. Still, for all the poetic scenarios we can conjure, the archaeological data resists a single narrative. We still don't know exactly how these trade networks were organized, who controlled them, and how the meanings of exotic materials shifted between being practical goods and symbols of social identity. There's also a fascinating paradox in value. Some objects, thin copper sheets, marine shell gorgets, or exotic stone beads, appear in elite burials. They seem to mark distinction. Yet similar objects sometimes appear in humble graves, or in ritual deposits where social rank seems less likely. Does that pattern indicate social stratification emerging in these communities, or does it reflect the logic of ceremonial economies that redistributed prestige periodically? Competing theories wrestle with those interpretations. One argues that emerging elites used exotic goods to consolidate power, building public architecture and commanding labor by demonstrating access to far-reaching exchange. Another suggests that elaborate gifting rituals intentionally circulated prestige objects precisely to prevent the solidification of permanent inequality, a redistributive mechanism that created social ties instead of hierarchies. A hybrid perspective notes both processes were in play. Some groups accumulated and displayed prestige to gain power, while the social expectation of reciprocal generosity tempered endless accumulation in many places. Each explanation rests on the careful reading of burial inventories, settlement size, and the contexts where exotic goods occur. The truth is likely multifaceted. Exchange practices can create both cohesion and difference, sometimes at once. We still don't know the precise balance between these forces across different Wisconsin communities and centuries. And then the stories that grow from these objects get mythic, naturally. A brass luster pendant pulled from a muddy grave becomes, in local narration 2 centuries later, evidence of a chief's lost crown or a proof that a vanished people once ruled the land. Newspapers in earlier centuries conflated exotic artifacts with tales of lost races or secret treasures, sometimes spawning treasure hunters who dug indiscriminately and destroyed contexts that might have told us far more. Oral traditions among descendant Indigenous peoples, in contrast, often maintained continuity of knowledge, objects as kinship tokens, as parts of reflected ritual obligations, or as memory keepers. In our work as investigators and storytellers, our duty is to respect those living traditions while employing scientific methods to trace the routes and meanings of materials. Picture yourself in a dim back room of a museum, turning a whelk shell bead in your fingers and feeling the rim worn by centuries of handling. Imagine the hands that wove that bead into a rope, the song that accompanied its making, the faces that looked upon it as a sign of connection. That intimate, human grasp is what the exotic materials ultimately deliver to us, the sense that distant places touched one another, and that connectivity mattered. But even so, when we lay out the maps, the distribution dots, the isotopic signatures that tie a bead to a shoreline hundreds of miles away, the full story of human intent and social choreography still eludes us. We still don't know the full story of how desire, obligation, and economy braided together to move objects across a continent. Now picture another scene, a hilltop with a cut stone aligned just so, a terrace that on the equinox catches the sun in a thin golden beam. The teaser is provocative. Ceremonial landscapes in Wisconsin may encode astronomical knowledge and seasonal rituals, but whether they were designed as calendars, as mythic theaters, or as markers of lineage remains hotly debated. Across the region, some mound alignments and stone lines show remarkable solar or lunar correspondences, particularly at solstices and equinoxes. Ethnographic parallels from descendant indigenous communities speak to a sacred calendar of movement, planting, harvesting, and ritual events tied to celestial cycles. The scale of precision varies. Some alignments are unmistakably intentional, where ridgelines frame sunrise on a particular date. Others are suggestive, using prominent landforms as seasonal markers in a landscape where travel and subsistence were rhythmically tied to time. Such correspondences invite bold claims that people used landscape architecture as an intergenerational calendar, encoding essential knowledge into earthworks and stones so that community memory could survive even when oral traditions were stressed by displacement. But here's where it gets tricky. Alignments can be accidental, the result of pragmatic positioning, choosing high ground or good drainage, and later readers might impose astronomical significance where none was intended. Rigorous archaeoastronomy demands careful controls, repeated measurements, statistical analysis of alignments across many sites, and correlation with reliable ethnographic or archaeological contexts. Some cases hold up to that scrutiny. Particular alignments appear at multiple contemporary sites, and patterns of associated artifacts or features corroborate ritual use. In other cases, the patterns dissolve under closer measurement. Competing theories argue either for widespread, deliberate calendrical landscape design by ritual specialists, or for more localized, ad hoc practices where alignments were occasionally used but not systematized into a broad cosmological program. The truth likely varies with time and culture. Some communities may have meticulously encoded celestial knowledge. Others may have used the landscape more flexibly, reading the horizon as needed. Picture yourself on a cool autumn evening, standing with elders at the lip of a mound as the sun slips behind a specific notch in the horizon, a moment of recognition that links people across generations. The image is powerful. The land becomes a living clock. The rising and setting of sun and moon narrate a community's year. Yet, when we try to prove that all mound-building communities use such precise calendrical schemes, the data force us back to modesty. We still don't know how uniformly such astronomical knowledge was encoded in built landscapes, who had access to that knowledge, and how it was taught and preserved. Across both of these segments, the braided story of exotic materials and the possibility of archaeological calendars, the same underlying dynamic returns. We can sketch movement and meaning in broad strokes, but the human specificity, the names and motives and exact rituals, remain out of complete reach. These are not failures, they are the conditions of rigor. Each new analysis, each new radiocarbon date, each isotopic test tightens the weave, but leaves the textile unfinished. Picture the map again, shell beads and copper discs like stars across it, stone alignments catching light at particular times of year. People whose lives were daily acts of making meaning within that world. The artifacts and alignments are the fingerprints they left behind. We still don't know the full story, but that not knowing is the engine of our curiosity, and it pushes us back into the field with better tools, deeper respect, and a louder sense of wonder. We come, finally, to the part of a long story where the threads that have run through our journey, earthworks carved into hill and ridge, copper hammered thin and bright, beads that have known shorelines far from this place, submerged posts holding the shadow of a past lake, stones arranged with a purpose we can only half guess, and the heavy bones of beasts at the edge of ice, are drawn together not into a tidy solution but into a single human argument about memory, meaning, and humility. If you have listened with patience, you know the contours by now. Wisconsin is not merely a map of towns and county lines, it is a palimpsest of gestures, a landscape written and rewritten by people whose lives were both ordinary and committed to acts that we would call monumental. The mounds are not just earth, they are stories told in the language of place. The copper is not merely metal, it is the sheen of exchange and the echo of hands that learned to shape the world. The submerged timbers are not simply drowned wood, they are proof that environments shift and that human life adapts, preserves, and sometimes loses in the slow calculus of centuries. What we have followed in each chapter, what we have tried to do with both rigor and reverence, is listen to those traces, lay them alongside one another, and let their friction produce a kind of meaning that is either purely sentimental nor purely scientific. It is the meaning of human beings who made choices in specific time and place, and it insists on being read by a mind that honors both data and imagination. Throughout this exploration, one theme has returned like a refrain. Uncertainty is not a flaw in our work, it is the doorway to better questions. Every radiocarbon date that tightens a chronology, every isotopic test that ties a bead to a distant shore, every careful excavation that reveals a stratified village surface, all of these narrow the field of possibility and refine our narratives. But each new piece of evidence also divides the field into new questions. What patterns of mobility underlay seasonal camps and permanent villages? How did ritual and economy braid together when a copper ornament meant both prestige and spiritual efficacy? Who held the right to shape communal landscapes into effigies, and how were those rights negotiated across generations? Rather than being the defeat of our curiosity, the presence of unanswered questions is the engine of inquiry. It makes the past alive. It refuses to let us fossilize our assumptions. Our best science, when honest, will name its limits and then design better tests. Our best storytelling will hold wonder and skepticism in a careful embrace, refusing either the easy romance of legend or the austere dismissal of everything that flirts with mystery. There is, too, a moral contour to how we conduct this work, something that a documentary voice must insist upon with clarity. The land we probe and the artifacts we discuss are rarely neutral objects. Many are sacred, many are the relatives of living peoples, and many carry ownership and cultural obligations that our curiosity must not override. We have to be explicit. Archaeological practice in the modern era carries an ethical responsibility to collaborate with descendant communities, to listen to oral histories as data of a different but equal kind, and to restore dignity where colonizing impulses have earlier denied it. When 19th-century treasure hunters dug into mounds heedless of context, they did not merely destroy information, they desecrated places that remain meaningful to people living today. When we approach a glacial kame or a submerged house floor, we must do so with protocols that respect Indigenous stewardship, consult tribal historians, and seek consent for research that touches on human remains or ceremonial material. Curiosity without care is violence. Curiosity with care is a practice of allyship and of knowledge building that is stronger for being shared. The human communities that hold these places in their memory are not relics of the past. They are partners in the present. Their voices alter hypotheses, reveal overlooked lines of evidence, and realign our priorities toward preservation and mutual understanding. Still, the science matters. The disciplines that have served to pull meaning from soil, stratigraphy, radiocarbon analysis, isotopic sourcing, microbotanical study, are the tools that convert wonder into plausible history. Used well, they are transformative. A pollen column extracted from a peat layer can speak with surprising specificity about the diet and season of occupation of a lakeside camp. A use-where analysis on a polished copper blade can indicate whether it was used in butchery or in ceremonial dress. A careful map of pottery temper and style can trace political conversations across a valley. But every technique has limits, and every interpretation remains provisional. We build models by accretion rather than decree, and the best research communities are those that invite revision, replication, and respectful disagreement. The past, after all, was not a single story laid upon the land, it was a chorus of many voices, and when we reconstruct those voices we must allow for polyphony rather than monologue. Our humility before evidence is a methodological virtue. It keeps us from forcing data to fit our preferred narrative, and keeps the door open to surprising, even transformative, reinterpretations. There is another reason why these mysteries matter beyond their immediate antiquarian appeal. They shift how we think about continuity and presence. So often public imagination treats indigenous histories as static backdrops against which colonial history plays out. But the sites we have visited, and the fractured but persistent records of exchange, adaptation, ceremony, and sometimes upheaval, remind us that what we call pre-contact, or ancient, was full of dynamism. People innovated, moved, traded, adapted, and sometimes suffered trauma in ways that echo our modern dilemmas. The effigy mounds are not just relics, they are alive in the sense that they continue to shape cultural identity and political claims today. The old copper artifacts are not museum curiosities. They are evidence of technological sophistication and of networks of relationship that span great distances. Recognizing that past dynamism helps us reframe contemporary discussions about land, stewardship, and identity. It challenges us to view the present landscape not merely as a resource to be exploited but as a living archive of human labor, memory, and moral obligation. Emotionally, the payoff for attending to these stories is not merely the thrill of mystery solved or the beauty of a well-crafted theory. It is the sense of kinship that emerges when you stand on a ridge and imagine the continuity of human presence, the small, intimate acts of daily life that bind us across centuries. A child running the length of a turtle mound is the same possibility we witness when children play among the same ridgelines today. A hand striking a copper nugget to make a blade is a creative act not unlike the labor of any craftsperson now. Tenderness, grief, joy, competition, and ritual, the full human register, are the currencies of the past and the present alike. When we honor that continuity, our study becomes not a conquest of the past but a conversation with it, an exchange that enriches both our understanding and our empathy. The stories we tell must, therefore, be generous enough to hold scientific detail and poetic enough to respect the human interiorities that objects imply. Finally, if there is a civic call embedded in this documentary arc, it is this: the past is not inert. It is threatened by development, by careless land use, by climate change that drowns shoreline sites and erodes kames, and by political choices that deprioritize preservation. Our collective choices will determine which questions remain open for future researchers and which will be locked forever behind bulldozers and drainage ditches. Protecting these sites is not merely an investment in scholarship, it is an investment in cultural memory, in the stories that make us who we are. That protection can take many forms: legislation that funds careful survey and curation, community-led stewardship programs that center descendant voices, educational initiatives that teach local children about the layered histories under their feet, and scientific projects designed with ethical review at their core. If you feel stirred by what you have heard, if a place described here calls to you, consider supporting local preservation groups, engaging with tribal cultural offices, or simply learning the names of the mounds and ledges in your area. The smallest act of attention, refusing to let a midden be hauled away, asking questions at a local museum, or teaching a curious child to respect a site, can make an outsized difference. The past survives where the present chooses to remember. So, as we close this journey, having walked in imagination beside stockades and submerged posts, having touched in thought the cool weight of hammered copper and the fossil heft of an ancient shoulder blade, let us resist the temptation to tidy the story into a single moral. The proper feeling is a mixture, awe at the scale of human creativity, sober anger at histories erased by careless digging and colonizing narratives, scientific pleasure at patterns coaxed out of dirt, and an enduring sense of wonder at how much remains unknown. The mysteries of Wisconsin are not curses to be dispelled or riddles to be finally solved for the satisfaction of closure. They are invitations to better questions and to better practices, practices that honor data, respect living descendants, and keep the land itself at the center of our curiosity. If you remember one thing from all these pages and sites, let it be this: the past is not an archive to be owned but a conversation to be continued. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.